All right, welcome everyone to the webinar on Citizens Assemblies, how and why they work. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fairvote Canada, and I'm really glad that you could all join us tonight. It's wonderful to see such a great response to this webinar on what for us is a really exciting topic. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through a short presentation, probably about 10 minutes, just to go over the basics of what are citizens' assemblies so that we're all on the same page about exactly what kind of process we're talking about. And then I'm going to introduce our three guests that we have today, which is David Moscrop, Shoni Field, and Steve Morgan. Okay, so I'm going to start with the presentation on citizens' assemblies. Okay, so a citizens' assembly is a group of people that are pulled together to deliberate on an important policy issue. So it's based around a belief that when you give citizens the time, the resources, the expert help, that basically they can become experts and that they can find solutions to issues that are really challenging. And sometimes they can even do this as well or better than our elected representatives because they're free of partisan interests, they're free of competing concerns, and they can really just drill down and focus on what the issue at hand is. A good way to think about a citizens' assembly is to contrast it to other processes. So, those of you who have been in the electoral reform movement with us for a long time will know that commissions and committees on this topic go back 100 years to 1923. And most of them consulted citizens in some way, either by reaching out into communities, holding meetings, or inviting people to come and testify to committees and commissions. So how is a citizens' assembly different? And this is what's really important. So over the last 5 or 6 years, citizens' assemblies have really been taking off around the world as a way to deal with national challenging issues where sometimes representatives need some help or have reached an impasse. And because of that, experts have come together to look at what are best practices. And one of the things that they've looked at is what constitutes what they call a deliberative mini-public. Here I'm calling it a citizens' assembly, which would sort of fall under deliberative mini-public as one of the processes that follows a certain procedure. So not everybody could call themselves a citizens' assembly. So if your neighbors all get together and decide, you're going to have a local neighborhood citizens' assembly and make some decisions on things, that's fine, but that's not what they're talking about. Citizens' assemblies, as far as what we're talking about, follow a certain process. So one, it's deliberative, obviously, right? Participants reach their conclusions after receiving lots of information, engaging in careful discussions. Often there's consultation with the public, and there's a certain process they go through from learning to deliberating to making a recommendation. The more important thing is that it truly aims to be a mini-public. So its members, so far as possible, constitute a subset of the wider population that's representative of everybody. So of course, you cannot get this exactly, but citizens' assemblies aim to get to this as closely as possible. So that the idea is that, say these 100 people sit down, over weeks or months to learn and deliberate on an issue, the conclusion that they come to will reflect what Canadians would have come to if all of them could have sat down and been part of that process, because the group at the table is truly representative of the Canadian population. So how do they do this? Well, the key thing is they must be demographically representative. And they do that by basing it on a civic lottery. So if you contrast that to the federal committee we had about 4 years ago now, where thousands of citizens did participate in consultation, but those were self-selected citizens. And that's not to put them down, because those are people who are passionate about the topic, who know what they're talking about, have really done their homework, they care a lot, they took their time to show up and share with the committee what their opinions were, but they weren't representative of the general public. So to get a group that's more representative of the general public, the organizations that conduct citizens assemblies would run a civic lottery. So tens of thousands of people would get letters asking them if they'd like to participate in a citizens assembly. And the idea is that everybody has an equal chance of receiving this letter. And then this is where the self-selection comes in. Obviously, only a certain number of people are going to respond to the letter, but there are things that you can put in place, such as small amount of compensation, having expenses covered, offering daycare, to get as high a response as possible. And then from the responses that come back from these letters, people are randomly selected. And they're randomly selected in a way that makes the Citizens Assembly demographically representative. So for example, you would want half men, half women. So of the responses that come in, they would be divided into men and women, and participants selected from those piles. So you can do that for as many criteria as you want to ensure that you have a breakdown by age, that you have a breakdown by race, that you have obviously people from every region of Canada, that you have different levels of education represented. You can do this for whatever criteria you want to create the most representative group possible. So another few things that are important is that participants in a citizens assembly are given expert help when they're learning and deliberating. So they're not an expert group, but they have access to experts. And usually there's an advisory panel who will determine who are the best experts for them to hear from. But the Citizens Assembly can call those experts back, and they can request different experts. So basically they're largely in charge of their own process to make sure that they know everything that they want and need to know before making a decision. Another key thing is that they're independent. And this is sort of like the civic lottery concept. This is one of the crucial concepts to designing a citizens assembly, especially on our issue where partisan self-interest has killed this consistently in one way or another for 100 years. Being independent of elected representatives is really important. Now, of course, the elected representatives will be able to come and testify and share their experience with the Citizens Assembly, but they aren't controlling it, they aren't influencing who's on it, they aren't directing it in any way. So the role of the government is to fund the Citizens Assembly, to hire a neutral third party to run this process. Finally, something that's really important and isn't talked about quite as much is that the government has a role in making sure that people know the Citizens Assembly is going on. So when you look at this process, of running a deliberative process, a deliberative body to study an issue, it works at all levels. So it can work, for a small local issue. In that case, it's not all that important that everybody in the town knows that there's a representative body deliberating to discuss whether to build a community center. It's nice, but it's not as crucial. But when you're running a national citizens assembly on electoral reform, it's really important that the general public knows the process is going on. They don't need to know what technical details the assembly is discussing this week, but they do need to know that a group of their fellow citizens are working on this issue on their behalf, and that they can engage with it and they can follow along if they choose. So like I was saying, this idea of the citizens jury, or, in the Netherlands, I think it is, the consensus conferences. The idea of these kind of groups has been around since, the 1970s. But it's only in the last, 5 or 6 years that it's really starting to take off around the world again, and to deal with more than smaller local issues, to deal with larger national issues. So what really got it going again was the Citizens Assembly in Ireland that helped Ireland overcome an impasse on abortion. But that assembly also tackled some really important other issues that don't make the news as much, climate change. And right now they're having a citizens assembly in Ireland on gender equality. The UK is having a citizens assembly on climate change right now, and that was started in the previous government and is continuing through this government. France is having a citizens assembly on climate change. Scotland is having a citizens assembly on the future of Scotland. You can't get much of a broader topic than that. Australia had one quite a few years ago that's worth mentioning because it was the largest one that I'm aware of that followed this exact process on the storage of nuclear waste, which was one of those issues where it was a highly political issue, and that's why they turned it over to the Citizens Assembly. Germany just had one on democracy, which actually wasn't run by the government. So ideally, you want these run by the government because obviously if the government commissions it, the government is more interested in listening to what it has to say. But in Germany, an NGO ran this process to kind of using an independent body to run it to help push the German government along a little bit on some areas to do with democracy. And in Belgium, they have actually set up a permanent Citizens Assembly to advise the government on different issues. And the Assembly, citizens actually get to choose what issues the Assembly works on. So something that came across the Twitter the other day, well, about a month ago, when the Citizens Assembly in France on climate got started, President Macron addressed them. And one thing he said that really caught my eye, he said, a Citizens Assembly would have saved me the yellow vests. And if you've been following all the controversy and crisis around the yellow vest movement in France, really you can't get a bigger endorsement of a Citizens Assembly process than that. So to sum up, a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform is a high-quality deliberative process. So it's like the gold standard process. It will bring in representative voices, so people from all walks of life, from all across Canada. It's going to build trust and legitimacy, and that's the key thing. You know, when a parliamentary committee deliberates on electoral reform, often it doesn't have that trust and legitimacy because people see that there are partisan interests at play, and that's how the media portrays it, as an issue of partisan interest. So it's really hard to say that it has a lot of legitimacy in terms of what they come up with if they actually are able to come up with anything. But a Citizens Assembly process would be seen as people just like me, you know, who are working on behalf of fellow citizens. And so the recommendation that they come up with will provide a foundation for any of the parties to run on implementing this. So it's, you know, it's a lot stronger than maybe, say, some committee that worked many years ago. Finally, in September, Fairvote Canada commissioned Angus Reid to do a poll asking about support for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. You know, it was briefly described, but then asked, you know, would you support this? And on average, 79% of respondents said that the next government, whoever forms government in October, should commission a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. So we know that this would be a popular idea that has support across parties and across citizens in different provinces. So now what I'd like to do is invite our special guests on, and I'm going to start with David. David, can you turn on your webcam?
How's that?
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to read out David's bio. So David is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Communication at the University of Ottawa. He's also a columnist for the Washington Post and Maclean's. You may have read some of his more recent things in Maclean's. And he's the author of a book called Too Dumb for Democracy, which hopefully we are not too dumb for democracy.
Question mark.
Question mark, right. Right, no bias. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to David to share his thoughts on citizens' assemblies in general and in relation to our issue. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Anita. I'll keep an eye on the clock and stick to 10 minutes or even a little bit less. So I've been a student and fan of citizens' assemblies for quite a long time. I studied them during my PhD and then when I was writing my book. And I see them as breaking down along functionally at least two lines. One is agenda setting. They have phenomenal capacity to put things on the agenda that might not otherwise be on the agenda. Not just issues, but ways of thinking about issues. things that politicians might not want to touch, might not want to say, or might not want to say in a specific way, can be brought onto the agenda through citizens' assemblies. So they're remarkably powerful in that sense. And of course, they're also powerful as vehicles for making decisions. I mean, they can also say, look, here's what we think we ought to do. And then, of course, you can either send that off to Parliament or send that off to a referendum, which we've seen here in Canada, for instance, on electoral reform. For instance, in British Columbia, where not too long ago, 57.7% of people listened to the Citizens Assembly and voted yes for electoral reform, but were stopped by an arbitrarily high, making some of the functions of a Citizens Assembly. But here's what makes them good. The idea of a CA is based on the belief that citizens, day-to-day, ordinary folks, have capacity. That when you put them in the right structure, when you mobilize their talents within a very particular institution, they can make good political decisions. And I define a good political decision as rational and autonomous. And this is what I talk about in my book. Rational in the sense that you collect information, data, about the world that is coherent and accurate, and autonomous in the sense that you come up with reasons to support your preferences. And citizens' assemblies are designed to allow for just that. And when you run these things, what you find is that it exposes capacity and it builds capacity so that people get better at being citizens by virtue of participating in these processes. And then they become civic nodes that other people can connect to themselves become better citizens. So rather than just having 338 people in Ottawa do the legislating all the time, you create these centers across that capacity. And so there's a capacity function. There's also a heuristic function. Citizens' assemblies are great ways to show other people what their options are and to give them a guide for thinking about an issue. So we don't have time as individuals to learn everything about every issue. And who wants to? We want to live our lives. One of the nice things about having a representative democracy is we don't have to spend all, but we want to make some political decisions and we want to make good ones. Well, we're going to rely on shortcuts, mental shortcuts or guides. And citizens' assemblies prove themselves to be very good at being those guides because people can look to them and say, well, I trust my peers. I trust my contemporaries. I trust my colleagues. And I'm going to look to their wisdom. And this is, for instance, what we see happen in Oregon around the Citizen Initiative Review panel that they have. There's also the opportunity to deliberate. Citizens' assemblies are extraordinarily good moments for deliberation where opponents, but as interlocutors, as subjects, as active subjects participating in self-government, rather than as opponents or objects that we're trying to dominate or beat. And then we exchange reasons back and forth, for and against one idea or another, one preference or another, until we can come to some mutual understanding. Now, that doesn't mean we'll build consensus. It doesn't mean we'll agree on everything, but at least we'll understand one another and we'll approach one another as subjects of governance rather than as passive objects to be governed. So there's a profoundly important deliberative function of the CA as well. And one of my favorites is they are anti-corruption vehicles. They're spaces, citizens' assemblies are spaces that are free from the sort of corrosive influence of money, of special interest, of all the sort of concerns that politicians, despite themselves, despite their best efforts sometimes, often become entrapped in. If you're a politician elected on a 4-year cycle, and it takes money to be elected, even in Canada, you become beholden sometimes to interests or become beholden to the popular opinion of the day or to pressure groups within your caucus, within your party, within your region, wherever it may be. Citizens' assemblies are protected spaces where those influences are mitigated, if not eliminated. So it provides a sort of sea of tranquility, sort of in the same way that often courts are protected from these influences. Or, somewhat ironically, the Senate. For instance, the Senate, which is meant to be a deliberative body, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, can talk about things like assisted dying 10, 15, 20 years before the House of Commons, because they don't have to worry about the forces of money or special interests or an electorate. And so the CA becomes a powerful place to do that work because it's set aside. And then it becomes democratically legitimate through two mechanisms. One, through sortition. I mean, as Anita was mentioning, these things are random or semi-random, and so they're legitimate through a sortition process that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, city-states, Athens, for instance. And of course, then whatever the CA decides can be run through a political process of say, referendum, or an elected legislature, the House of Commons, or Parliament in the provinces, or a city council, where these the decisions can be affirmed, or debated, modified, passed, or not passed, and so they get democratically checked on the other end. So, in the context of electoral reform, citizens' assemblies are a powerful tool for all the reasons I've mentioned, especially on top of it all, they can help folks understand what the issue is, what electoral reform is, what the options are, and give them some ways of thinking about it that aren't poisoned by partisan rhetoric or the rhetoric of special interests that come in that want to mislead or often overly politicize different elements of the electoral reform movement. So, I don't think we want citizens' assembly for every issue all the time, but we do want them for certain issues. We certainly could use them for intractable issues. I think of Macron, France, and climate change. And quite frankly, one idea that I've been shopping around for a while to different political parties is the idea of a standing citizens' assembly that would meet every X number of years, 1, 2, 3, 5, to set the agenda, to say, here are several priorities that we want to talk about that we don't think the government is talking about or not talking about sufficiently, and we're going to put that on the agenda, and here's some ideas we have to forward those issues. And through that sense, we don't have to replace representative democracy, elected democracy, but we can complement it by mobilizing citizen power and bolstering our institutions, protecting our institutions, and preparing for better governance in face of the challenges that are coming at us, not the least of which is climate change. So that is about 8 minutes worth of time, and I'll leave it there so that we've got lots of time for questions later.
Thanks, David. That's awesome. All right, I'm going to invite on Shoni now. Shoni, can you turn on your webcam and sound? Okay, unmute.
There. The
There you are.
unmute with sticky.
Okay, so I wanted to introduce Shoni Field. She was a member of the BC Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And, when you read about citizens' assemblies in all the different literature around the world, the number of times the BC Citizens Assembly comes up is amazing. Even though this idea didn't start with them, in a way, they were a pioneer for the kind of processes that are going on today. She campaigned for electoral reform for STV in 2005 and 2009. She was president of Fairvote Canada, and I met her at that time, back in 2012, 2013, whenever it was that I got involved. And she is a co-founder of Unlock Democracy and chaired Vancouver's Independent Election Task Force. So I'll turn it over to Shoni to talk about her experience on the BC Citizens Assembly.
Thank you, Anita. So I'm going to go through, start off by talking about what we did and then how we did it, and then sort of my observations or learnings or takeaways from that. So starting off, because it was a long time ago and not everyone on the call is from BC, we had sort of a perfect storm in BC where we had a wrong winner, followed by the following election where the government was decimated and we had no opposition. So we had people who voted for both of the two main political parties at the time saying this system's broken, things are not working. And so that created an appetite politically to do something and look at this. And that's really important because although we're talking about taking something out of the political spectrum, we unfortunately need some sort of political support to undertake this work to begin with, to have the Citizens Assembly struck. And so whether that comes from intense citizen pressure or a feeling or that sort of perfect storm, that was really important. So we had 160 members. They were a woman and a man from each constituency and 2 additional First Nations members. And we were chosen, it was a random, followed by self-selection, followed by random. So they sent out letters in each constituency. If you felt you could take on the work, then you replied and said you were interested. And then of the people that were interested, it was a random draw. A random draw out of a big, tall, stripy Dr. Seuss hat. So we went to work in 2004 and spent the year working on it. We had sort of 3 phases. The first phase was our learning phase. We were learning about voting systems, and we were learning about BC's electoral history, demographic history, and also while we were learning, we were also working and making our first decisions, and those were value decisions. What are our core values? How do we prioritize these values? So we ended coming out of that step having identified 3 core values. We were looking at proportional outcomes. We wanted to strengthen local representation, or we wanted local representation, and we wanted voter choice were the top 3 that we were looking for. And we went into phase 2, which was our public consultation phase. We had town hall meetings across BC for 2 months. And each member of the Citizens Assembly went to at least 3 of those meetings. And we had a forum where we were sharing what we were hearing at those meetings and looking for commonalities, looking for unique things that we hadn't heard anywhere else. And then continue on that public consultation, we spent the summer reading 1,600 written submissions. I think at the time, no public process in BC had ever had as many written submissions. And those ranged from 2 to 3 sentences, I support this system or I support that system, to 30, 40 pages with footnotes and academic references. So it was a dense reading for the summer. And then we came out of that in the fall and reviewed what we'd heard, talked about, what had struck us out about those written submissions, what we'd heard across the province, and came back and looked at these, our values again. Had what we heard changed them? Were we still focusing on these same core areas? Were there sort of some secondary issues that we wanted to look at? And taking those into the next step, which was identifying what systems met our values. So looking at those 3 systems I talked about, we started evaluating the various voting systems that were before us, and including our own current first past the post system. And this was a really interesting part of our work because this is the part of our work that most often gets misrepresented. And it's a very bizarre process to be part of something that's had articles and books written about you and having people speculate as to what you were thinking and why you made certain decisions and having them be totally wrong. So we started looking at these values of proportional representation and local representation and voter choice, and some really interesting things started to happen. Actually, in terms of local representation, very early on, the members started sort of disputing one of these accepted truths of first past the post of, criticize what you want to about first past the post, but it sure delivers on local representation. And people started saying really quickly, hold on a second, it delivers quantitative local representation. I have a body who represents me. I don't feel that I'm getting qualitative local representation. I don't feel that that person, even with the best of intentions, can speak up for my community, can advocate for my community, can, in short, do anything that's out of step with what their party or their whip are telling them they can do. So we started questioning, what does local representation mean? Is it simply a geographic tie, or are there sort of more qualitative sense of local representation? We also started doing, at this point, a fair bit of simulations and computer projections to try and figure out what the proportionality of the various systems we were looking at would be, so we could assess, are we giving up a degree of proportionality in order to get more voter choice and more local representation, or vice versa. And so we went through this process of, we narrowed down to two systems we were looking at: a single transferable vote system, a mixed member proportional system. And we built out models of what they would each look like. They all have little details that define exactly what flavor of mixed member proportional or STV you would get. And so we all were defining those. And I think that was really important that we built those models before we chose what model we were putting forward, because everyone, no matter their preference, was really invested in building something that would work. If we ended up recommending something that wasn't our first choice, at least we'd been involved in the building of it, and we were comfortable that it did meet the values that we'd identified. So we went through that process. We then moved on to, in the end, as you know, select a single transferable vote as the one that best met our values. And then we made our recommendation. And I say that our work had 3 phases, but it actually had 4, because we realized very quickly that there was no investment being made in public education. And from very early on, we started sending requests to government to say, can you please tell us how you're going to invest in sharing the information about our process? And so as a result, when we had our official last meeting, of the 160, 120 some odd, I think, decided to stay involved throughout the referendum campaign and share our story with the people of BC. And so we went out to town hall meetings and church basements and school gyms and Rotary clubs and people's living rooms. We did a ton of media interviews, and we did this on a budget of about $600. We had 2 cell phones to take media requests and a website one of our members had built. So we went through that process, and as David said, we got 57.7% of people voted to change. By the way, only 2 governments in BC have ever been elected with higher support than that. And also passed the second barrier, which was it had to pass 50% in certain number of ridings. It passed that in 77 out of 79. So we were talking about sort of this, so that's what we did. Looking at how we did it, we operated, as I sort of, on a consensus building model, where we weren't going to use Robert's Rules of Order. We were going to say, okay, nothing's decided till everything is decided. We can come back and revisit this. And we're going to start with the values, and we're going to move towards the more technical details. And that was really critical of getting buy-in. We got some quick wins early on and build trust with each other, because we knew that if we discovered new information, we could revisit. But by making those value decisions, we knew later on, when we started to disagree with each other about the technical parts, that we were all coming from a united place of what we'd agreed was most important for British Columbians. We also had different opportunities for input. So we had a lot of large group sessions, we had small group sessions, we had an online forum. Some people were quiet as a mouse in the large group sessions, but in between weekends when we were meeting, would be very active in the online forums, and would just have like pages and pages of research that they'd be sharing. And they'd be seen as sort of very influential because they were sharing information that other people hadn't found yet. And so I thought it was really important that we had those different ways of participating. I think what made it work, and a couple of these things have been alluded to already, but the reason why no other referendum has come close to this in terms of support is I think the source of the recommendation was really important. People recognized that it was people like them, that they felt if they'd gone through the process, they may have come to a similar recommendation, that there was no vested interest or only the sort of shared equal vested interest of wanting to make politics better in BC. And that there was a perception that we had ownership of it. We would talk about times where we decided we needed to hear from a different speaker, or we disagreed with some of the information in the education systems and went out and brought more education sessions and brought more information in. So I think that perception of ownership and trust in fellow citizens was really important. And we saw in that first referendum that UBC was doing these rolling polls each night through that whole process. And it was something ridiculous, like 70 to 80% of British Columbians said that they'd heard directly from a Citizens Assembly member. Now, clearly this is impossible, but what it meant was I think that, they'd seen a story about us in one of their local papers. They'd heard of us on the local radio station. Their neighbor had met one of us, and it felt like a personal connection, and so it felt more trusted. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just looking at my notes to see what else I really wanted to get to. I think one of the what we heard, not only did people say, we trust you, we think this is a great process. Some people say we wish we could just skip the referendum and have citizens' assemblies make the decision. People also said, I wish I'd got that letter. I was waiting to get that letter. And we heard that so many times and really disputed that. And the number of people sending input really, I think, laid rest to the fact that people are apathetic. People were just really badly wanted a way to participate that was meaningful to them. And this, knowing it was going straight to referendum, was highly meaningful. We got a lot of questions around, the input we got of, why are you valuing experts and non-experts equally? And we said, well, everyone's an expert. Like, everyone who lives in BC has expertise in how they experience the political system. We took on a lot of academic information. We heard from a lot of people who'd been studying this for a very long time, but we also valued that lived experience, who said, hey, when I live in Dawson Creek, this is what it's like for me to talk to my MLA. I have to get up really early. I have to drive this far. It's a huge distance. And so we did value that lived experience as well, which I think was really important. And then just one last quick thing that I think is really important about citizens' assemblies, from my experience, is it got people away from very entrenched values, to the extent that I'm one of the poster children from this of, you can be wrong, you could admit you're wrong, or you can embrace the other. I was, for a very long time within this assembly, a proponent of mixed member proportional. I believed in the system that we went along. I believed in the values, and when we as a group chose single transferable vote, I became one of the more prominent advocates for that in the referendums that followed. Because I trusted the process, because I saw the value of my fellow citizens' input, which I started to see that my first preference had come from my lived experience. And when I started bringing in a more collective group of people, I could see the values and why in the end I've come to believe that single transferable vote was the better option for BC. But I think that ability to have a deliberative space where you can change your mind, it was really, really important. And I could go on for a lot longer, but I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm sorry for going over, but I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Shoni. That's awesome. And now we have Steve Morgan. So, Steve, are you still on the phone with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So, sorry we don't have a video of Steve, but he is able to join us on the phone. So, Steve is a health economist in the School of Population and Public Health, and he has represented Canada on pharmaceutical policy committees of the World Health Organization. He was the research lead for the Citizens Reference Panel on Pharmacare in Canada, which is something not a lot of people know happened. But the experience of that is so relevant to what we're talking about today. So I've asked Steve to share his experience of that process, how and why it worked. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will make my comments brief, I think, and apologize that I'm running around doing errands. This is the after school era for my kids. And so I'm trying to get kids off to different activities and whatnot. But as mentioned, I was involved in actually the research lead for the Citizens Reference Panel on Pharmacare in Canada. I am an academic. I'm an economist that has been studying prescription drug coverage and access in Canada and comparable countries for about 25 years or so. I had been involved in studies of whether, and if so, how Canada should move forward on a national pharmacare program dating all the way back to the mid-1990s, and had been studying this issue for a long enough time in collaboration with enough levels of government that when the topic of national pharmacare seemed to have traction in the era of about 2015, I was approached by a variety of stakeholders in government and in health professions and in patient advocacy or citizens advocacy to ask, what more can be done to really give a clear and compelling answer around what Canada should do. And we gave it some thought, and having had already seen national commissions like the National Forum on Health in the 1990s and the Roman Oak Commission in the early 2000s, having seen those formal kind of august bodies deliberate this topic and come up with similar recommendations, but nothing happened, and having seen national opinion polls be done by a wide variety of groups that look at that ask the question about whether Canadians have difficulty filling the prescriptions that their doctors and nurse practitioners write for them, whether or not Canadians think that we should move forward with including medicines into Canadian Medicare. We saw time and time again, citizens on opinion polls strongly supported this idea of universal coverage of medicines as part of Canadian Medicare. But it didn't seem to have traction. And so with input from particularly some senior policymakers in a couple of the provinces and the federal government, to David's point, actually people who reached out to us as leaders in the academic community to say, look, we can't ask these questions because we can't be seen as discussing this issue because it might have certain amounts of precedent. They reached out to us and said, could you, work on this problem and come up with a way to have a credible answer? And I had been impressed by citizens panels. I recalled the citizens jury here in British Columbia. I recalled some deliberative dialogues that had been done on the Ontario healthcare system, probably about 5 or 10 years prior to us getting involved in the Pharmacare reference panel. And despite the fact that many of my academic peers at UBC, at McMaster, and other universities had actually kind of done this themselves, they had convened deliberative dialogues themselves. Myself and my colleagues, we talked about this and thought, it is probably foolish for an academic to just try to run a deliberative dialogue that is should be meaningful and should follow best practices for these kinds of engagement. So we set out an RFP and contacted a couple of organizations and firms that specialize in doing this kind of thing and said, look, we've got a tight timeline and a modest budget, but this is something that is important. And we felt that given that part of the motivation was the interest of policymakers in the Canadian environment, we thought that this could have potential traction if done well. We ended up hiring Mass LDP out of Toronto, which is a firm that specializes in deliberative dialogue, to hit on the methodological points that we've already discussed in this webinar. We did want our deliberative dialogue to use a sortition mechanism to make sure that it was random in the sense that we were using a civic lottery, but quasi-random in the sense that we would also have a purposefully structured sampling frame to make sure that we had representation across Canada. So we had 10,000 letters go out to Canadians inviting them to participate in this process. We clearly identified that the process had been funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as well as the University of British Columbia, University of Toronto, and a nonprofit organization called the Mindset Social Innovation Foundation. It did not say that this was a government thing, and that might have actually affected participation rates. I think if we had officially said it was from the government of Canada, maybe more people would have participated. But we were, in fact, somewhat overwhelmed by the number of Canadians that put their hand up, that replied to that mass mail out saying that they actually would like to give up 5 days of their time and come to Ottawa and talk about this issue and how it could be resolved for Canada. We had a purposeful sampling frame to represent the geography of Canada, languages of Canada, visible minorities, the mix of ethnic backgrounds as best as possible with a very simple framework or simple questionnaire of people who are volunteering. We also included, because our topic was about healthcare and access to medicines, we very carefully selected that we did not oversample the number of people who had access challenges, because we knew there might have been a selection bias there. So we made sure that the participants were roughly representative of Canada in terms of their needs for medicines, their level of coverage in both private and public insurance, and that kind of thing that was relevant to our question. We did do the best we could within our limited budgets to make sure that participants were not compensated for participating. This is a volunteer exercise, but they were fully reimbursed for travel costs. They were offered childcare both at home to cover expenses if that was necessary, or in Ottawa or Hull, as it were, for the meeting. We offered elder care or other forms of assistance if people had caregiving responsibilities at home that they needed to be taken care of, and of course travel accommodations and food and whatnot. Our process, I would say, as a researcher, it was a really fascinating opportunity for me to observe actually a deliberative process. So one of the things that people, and particularly my peers in the academic community, aren't quite familiar with is that these deliberative processes, when well facilitated, and I think that Peter McLeod and the Mass team did a great job of this one, is it really is for and by the participants in the panel. And so in our particular circumstance, I observed the panel. I helped chair the advisory council or advisory committee that identified what was 19 different speakers representing a variety of areas of expertise, patient experience, health professional groups, insurance companies, benefits consultants, pharmaceutical manufacturers in both the brand name and generic sector, retail pharmacies, and all, basically the various stakeholders that you'd expect to weigh in on this kind of issue. We gave each of them an opportunity to present to the panelists in this reference panel. I observed and was there to, on the third day, answer questions the panelists might have after essentially all of those presentations had wrapped up. But then I was just an observer and was able to take part in the sense of watching as the process played out. I often tell people when I'm talking about this experience in particular that as a researcher, there were times during this experience where I felt like I had practically violated research ethics, in the sense that it was actually a remarkably emotional experience for the people participating in the panel, in part because as they heard stories, both from the people presenting, but also from each other in the sessions, they came to realize that, at least as it relates to access to medicines, Canada is not as fair and equitable as they might have thought. And interestingly enough, the people who actually had better coverage for medicines, maybe because of the particular province that they lived in or the particular job that they had, they were the people who actually came out of the panel almost most animated about how urgent it was that we address this issue, that some Canadians literally can't get the medicines that they or their children need because of the province they live in or the place they work at. So our process was compressed because of budget constraints. We weren't a government being able to do a very large deliberative process. We would have liked to have done our process over the course of multiple weekends, with time between sessions for people to distill the information they heard. Instead of doing that, it was 5 days of deliberative dialogue in a room, all of it simultaneously translated for French and English. And then the interaction amongst the group was facilitated by Mass LBP in terms of them discussing virtually by email and online interactions about how to revise and tailor their recommendations. The recommendations of the committee were consistent with, but slightly different than, the recommendations that had come out of formal national inquiries, whether it's royal commissions or things like the National Forum on Health. We were delighted when the report did come out. The panelists, or at least members of the panel, as well as the chair from Mass LBP, were invited to speak before the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health to present their findings to the Standing Committee, which I think was a great opportunity for them to have some impact on policy recommendations that would come out from that. They also had the opportunity to present their recommendations to the government's more recent advisory council on the implementation of national pharmacare, and I'm happy to see that that report, it also makes mention of the deliberative process and of the recommendations made by that group. All in all, I was somewhat of a fan of deliberative processes before going into organizing one on a topic matter I was close to, and then following that process, I've become an even greater fan of this kind of democracy, this kind of consensus building, or even shaping of recommendations that comes out of not people sitting anonymously at a poll or responding to a telephone survey, but people sitting face to face, talking about issues, talking about evidence and experiences that they've come across or that they've had personally, and then coming to an understanding of each other and of the content and building policy recommendations collectively. That was truly powerful to observe as an expert in the field. And I think in our particular domain, although you can't point to that panel as being the most influential thing in the national narrative that has emerged around Pharmacare in Canada, I think there's no question that, consistent with the idea that certain policymakers had asked that we do this because they couldn't, but they thought that it would be helpful. I think that the Citizens Reference Panel on Pharmacare certainly had an impact. So I'll leave it with that and look forward to hearing the discussion that follows.
That's great. Thank you very much, Steve. Very powerful and insightful sharing from all the guests. I'm going to invite Shoni and David to turn their webcams and microphones back on so we can take some questions. And there actually are a few questions, and they're good questions. Let me just find them here. So go ahead.
While you're looking, I've been looking at a couple, so can I jump in?
Yeah, jump in and read it out so that everybody can know what it is.
There's a couple, some that I answered in writing that are all around the same theme. So I want to jump in. A lot of questions around who were our academic experts, who prepared our materials, and a number in that area. And then Mark asking, Shoni, can you clear up the conspiracy theory myth that Ken Carty directed you to adopt STP? I met Ken once at the OCA, and he seemed still bemused about the autonomy of your group. I think Ken's probably still bemused by the autonomy of our group. I remember the second or third week him saying, wow, how do you know we are not in Poli-Sci 101 anymore? Because we're all arguing with him. And so we had a couple of lead academics from UBC who presented the materials, and they were really Poli-Sci 101, except for that they don't teach electoral system, Poli-Sci 101. But these are the mechanics of this system and how it works. We also then had about 4 or 5 guest speakers who came in, and those were generally in areas where we said, we want to know more. Can you bring us in a specialist in this area? In terms of the conspiracy theory, and I alluded to that when I said that I was impatient about people writing and telling me what I was thinking over the years, is because early on we seemed to be moving towards MMP, and the bulk of the submissions that named a system named MMP, and then we ended up going with STB, people speculated that because Ken had connections to Ireland and Ireland used STB, and because we used David Farrell's book as a reference and he was from Ireland, that we were directed or pushed to adopt STB. In fact, what happened was that we had very early on identified that STB delivered better quality local representation and better quality voter choice, but we weren't willing to sacrifice proportionality. We had a member who was really good at doing computer simulations, and we were able to put in the mechanics of our systems and then start running them through thousands of models of elections, and saw that our 2 models actually would deliver similarly proportional results. So once proportionality was similarly equal in both cases, then we could turn to the other 2 values, and STB delivered stronger on those other 2 values. So that's the conspiracy theory that wasn't.
Okay. Whoa, you guys hear an echo? Or is it just me? Okay, it must be just me. Okay. So I've got a question here about, you know what? I just want to backtrack one thing, because I think it's really important, because this is an electoral reform group, to say this in light of Shoni's excellent explanation about how nobody manipulated the Citizens Assembly. They actually came to their conclusions through independent thought. It's also important to note that another thing Shoni said many, many times is that PR supporters need to get beyond bickering about models, because either one would be a huge improvement over first past the post, so just in case anybody's wondering about that.
It is our hugest stumbling block as a movement, that we will not throw ourselves wholeheartedly behind any proportional system. Be like, well, yes, but only if it's my favorite.
Right. Which is another reason why a citizens assembly is a great idea, because it just provides that basis for consensus. Yeah, because of the legitimacy of the process. Somebody's asked what size of citizens assembly would be appropriate to form a representative mini public of Canada. Is there a size at which they become unwieldy? Do you want me to tackle this so we can all chime in? I mean, I guess I can just say I'm not an expert in designing citizens assemblies, and I mean that's one of the key things is the quote unquote special interest group isn't the one who's going to be deciding how these things are run. Thank goodness. So I don't have the answer for that. In Ontario and in BC, they made sure there were two people from each riding. Is that practical in Canada? Can you have a citizens assembly with 600 to 700 people? Not likely. I saw the one in Australia on nuclear waste storage. It was the largest one following that model, and there was about 300 people. And it was the only one that I've heard where they actually didn't come to an almost unanimous consensus. There was about 2/3 for one position and 1/3 strong dissenters. And so it led to some kind of explorations, wondering if 300 and more people is too much to build that sense of cohesiveness, community, shared ownership, all the things that Shoni talked about. So I don't have a magic answer. I think it's more important that it's representative, that there's somebody from at least one person from each region, that it's gender balanced, that it's, that it's balanced, and so that it is a mini subset of Canada. But I don't think that we would be, anybody would be strictly applying the one or two people from each riding criteria. Thoughts?
And it's not a legislature either, right? I mean, the goal isn't to have one person per 100,000 Canadians or whatever it might be. I mean, the goal is to bring together a broadly representative group of people who can deliberate over an issue and come up with something that they can share with the broader population. So this is where it's important to remember that the output of the Citizens Assembly goes somewhere. It goes to a referendum. It goes to the legislature, the town, the city council, the provincial legislature, whatever it might be. But there's also different models. I mean, Belgium had the G1000, for instance, where they brought together, it wasn't quite 1,000 people. I think it ended up being about 700 and change. But then they broke them into smaller groups. So there's different ways to stack these things once you've brought them together. But the big takeaway is that you don't want too many people because it becomes unwieldy. And then it has to then connect to something beyond itself, because ultimately it's going to produce some sort of outcome. That outcome has to go somewhere, and that's out into the broader public.
Mm-hmm. I tend to, not based on any sort of science around group dynamics, but agree with Anita that 300 may be too large. And we don't need someone from every or every riding, but I think we do need, for that legitimacy, some people to see themselves in it. So see someone from, it might not be this particular riding, but that region of that province. But geographic is just one of them. We've talked about geographic, we've talked about gender, ethnic balance, having a First Nation, strong First Nations representation. We had also in the BC Citizens Assembly, fairly strong, the age representation, actually fairly closely mirrored voting age. We had, I think, someone who just turned 19 and an 82-year-old, and so at both ends of the spectrum. So we, I think all of those ways of it being a reflection is really critical.
There's another question here. I'm going to read it out. It's a sort of an interesting question. The rational analytical process proposed for CAs, although aiming to be nonpartisan, is arguably itself a partisan approach, especially on the right. Anecdotal rules and the scientific approach is regarded as a suspicious liberal idea. In light of that, how can we engage all sides of an issue sufficiently to give the assembly legitimacy?
I would suggest that maybe that's one of the beauties of why assemblies do work, because they are a mix, and not ascribing any of these to a particular partisan viewpoint, but they are a mix of lived experience and research, scientific, academic experience. And so it blends those in a way that seems organic or natural for your average voter. And so I think that does help, that it mixes those two things.
Did you have a comment, David?
Well, I only that. I mean, any process like this is going to have to be, broadly speaking, rational. I think the risk is that it becomes technocratic, that it becomes expert-driven, and the whole point of these democratic processes, citizens' assemblies and things like it, is that expertise, as my former supervisor and deliberative Democrat Mark Warren would say, expertise has no pre-political authority in a democracy. You might be an expert, or you might have lived experience for that matter, but when we're making decisions together, that doesn't have any value a priori. It has value because you present it to me and you give me reasons. Maybe you tell me a story, maybe you cite statistics, but you don't claim it on the basis of authority. You try to persuade me through reason giving and through evidence, however that evidence might take, whatever form that evidence might take. So, it's rational in the sense that it's based on reasons that have some content that I can make sense of, but it doesn't mean that it's inherently technocratic or expert driven. And I think that's the distinction we need to make, that the process is ultimately about us giving reasons that we can understand back and forth, and not give any pre-political authority to either lived experience or expert testimony.
I just wanted to add something too. The whole idea of, Fair Vote calling for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform, we are asking that all options be on the table. So that when you're talking about, appealing to people of different partisan persuasions, it's not a citizens assembly to design some version of somebody's partisan preference system or something. It's, saying, what, we're going to look at this, come in with your view that you have already, and we're going to look at everything from scratch objectively. And that's part of what gets the buy-in. If we can only get buy-in for this idea from people who already want proportional representation, it's not going to work. The idea of the Citizens Assembly is that it establishes a larger trust among the population, that this is a good process for left, right, center, clueless, everybody.
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the frustrating experiences I had during the electoral reform shenanigans federally a couple of years ago was that, and in British Columbia, I kept saying, look, we've got to commit at the outset to a process that everyone sees as fair and legitimate and not preordained. And if we can commit to that process, then we can meet on those terms and build off of that. If we don't commit to the process at the outset, then we risk this descending into God knows what, the cynical nonsense that the Liberals went ahead with their joke of a consultation process, which was quite frankly offensive, or the British Columbia referendum that was a dog's breakfast of options and lacked sufficient heuristics to be compelling to a lot of people. And so, I'll double down on the fact that a citizens' assembly is a good strategic move, removed from whatever preference you might have, because it unites people around a process they see as fair, inclusive, and objective. And so that's part of the reason these things are so powerful. Especially electoral reform, by the way, since politicians often have preferred systems that they think will help their party. Right?
That's specifically why it's so good for our issue, because politicians, whether they want to be or not, are in an inherent conflict of interest, unfortunately, on our issue.
Certainly appear to be, at least, right?
Yeah.
Which is the same thing to a voter.
Right, both real and appeared. Yeah, exactly. One thing that Shoni was talking about, and I think Steve and David might also have some comments on this. Just when Shoni was saying the Citizens Assembly got people away from their entrenched positions. And, that was really powerful. And one of the concerns a lot of people have right now is this whole thing about the rise of populism and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, I hope this isn't too off topic, but if either of you could address the whole idea of citizens' assemblies as a kind of counter to that, a way for people to influence each other and get beyond those tribes. Like right now everybody's sort of stuck in warring tribes. How do you use a citizens assembly to help overcome some of that? Do you guys know what I mean? I don't know how exactly to ask it.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I want to be in the spirit of the Citizens Assembly and not. But very quickly, I'll say. I mean, there's always going to be some of that division. I mean, every group is going to divide a little bit along those lines. But one of the arguments I make in my book, when I'm talking to people and when I'm championing direct democracy or participatory democracy, is that we think people are inherently incapable of making good political decisions because X, Y, or Z. Because they're ignorant, because they're uneducated, because they're not experts, because whatever. We come up with all kinds of reasons. And the pushback is, it's not the people, it's the institutions. And when you put people in good institutions, there'll be a few rotten apples, there always are, but the vast majority of people show phenomenal capacity. And it's not the people, it's the institutions. And so if we want to start to resist some of these impulses, then we need to build better institutions. Because populism isn't the problem. There's nothing wrong with populism. Toxic populism, xenophobic populism, authoritarian populism is the problem. There's nothing wrong with people wanting a say. But the problem is when it's channeled through institutions that are toxic, it becomes toxic.
Okay, somebody has a question here. She says, I'm involved in Extinction Rebellion. One of our 4 demands is that the ecological transition be overseen by a citizens' assembly. One argument I've heard against a citizens' assembly on climate change is that climate change is a, quote, technical issue, unlike abortion rights or state independence, and so it's better tackled by experts, not citizens. Is ecological transition a good topic for a CA? I think we can sort of talk about this in general in terms of the principles of citizens' assemblies.
I think it meets all the criteria of it's something that needs a lot of deliberation. It's something that politicians have a lot of vested interests in one outcome or another, and it's hard for them to get beyond that. Actually gives them a bit of political cover to get beyond that. And it is, again, one of those mixes where people can learn technical matter. They can learn scientific findings. But what's important, I think, that's likely to make change is people bringing their lived experience to it and saying, like, this is unacceptable. The motivation for change is how I'm experiencing this is wrong and we can't do this. And I think that's going to be the only strong motivation for change.
Yeah, my friend and colleague, Michael McKenzie, has written about many publics around salmon genomics. There are many publics on all kinds of things, including highly technical things. And I'll go back to the point that if it's a political issue, then the technical bits are incidental to the broader moral guidance of what we should do about the issue. I mean, nuclear disarmament or nuclear proliferation is also a technical issue. So is city planning, so is neighborhood planning, so is zoning, so are roads, so are taxes. I mean, in fact, there's very little that isn't a mix of technical and moral. And so there are very, very few issues that aren't right for a citizens' assembly. And I'd argue that climate change is inherently a moral issue in the same way that any moral issue is a moral issue. And so I would say it's, as Shoni mentions, it's perfectly suited for that, in fact. And to the participant who's a member of Extinction Rebellion, thanks for your work and give them hell.
To me, it was very interesting when we started recommending a Citizens Assembly and Electoral Forum to find out that Extinction Rebellion was calling for a Citizens Assembly, because the thought that came to my mind is, okay, they want the more, I'm going to use this word even though it's not a good word, I just can't think of another word, the more extreme or radical solutions, but yet they're willing to put it to a Citizens Assembly. They already have an idea of what should be done and when it needs to be done, but they want to put it to a Citizens Assembly. So a lot of parallels with the electoral reform movement, because basically it's about trusting people, realizing that having the expertise or scientific answer doesn't always lead to change, that there needs to be a process that builds buy-in to get you where you want to go. And they're willing to give up, control, which they don't really have anyway, but, give up control to a group of randomly selected citizens who might not even be interested in this issue to make recommendations. And so that's about having trust in people and trust in that process.
Anita, there's a couple of questions about funding campaigns, to which I don't believe there is a good answer yet. And so, we ran where we got the best results, 2005. The Citizens Assembly alumni, like I mentioned, had $600. There was a pro campaign. There was an anti-campaign that was just sort of hoping it would be too complex and people wouldn't actually care. And so it sort of didn't really run effectively. But we got our best results. And then when we get an investment from the government in public education campaigns, or not in a public education campaign, actually in a pro and an anti, we get much lower results. And so I'm really torn still on what the model is. I think there needs to be a lot of education, but I'm no longer convinced that investing in money in the pro and anti sides is a good way to go.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just chime in on that. I mean, one thing that Shoni said that really struck me is when she said, we went out to share our story with the people of BC. And to me, that just struck home. We went out to share our story of who we are and why we care about this and how we made a decision together for the benefit of everyone in BC. How different is that from, I got a government pamphlet explaining some model to me that I can't even understand? That's totally different than sharing your story. I think that's part of what led to the success. So, like I said about government funding, it is really important that the government invests so that people know that this process is happening and know that it's people just like us and they hear those stories. I don't think that's as important as spending $50 million to try to make sure everybody can explain how a quota works. If you guys follow what I'm saying, it's the kind of quote unquote education, is important. But yes, if there's no funding behind it, then the work of the Citizens Assembly will stay with the Citizens Assembly, and that's what we don't want, right? So we need that government commitment to publicize the process. Do you guys see any others that are jumping out at you about whether they're binding? This is something we get asked all the time too. The whole idea of if we get a Citizens Assembly, can we go into it where the results are binding? Whatever they recommend, the government has to legislate it. I mean, the simple answer to that is no, really.
No, yeah, the answer is no, and in part that's because of lines of accountability. But there are two general models. One is that the Citizens Assembly then goes to a referendum, and the other is that it goes to a legislature. I'm not a big fan of referendums. I don't find them to be particularly they're nasty. They often ask yes or no to complicated issues that bring about a kind of nasty, simplistic politics. I would much rather a citizens' assembly than go to a vote in a legislature, and that the legislature is not legally bound to pass whatever the CA says, because they ultimately have to be accountable for what they're passing, so they have to have the right to amend it or reject it. But they're going to be morally bound and perhaps politically bound, so that there's a cost to rejecting this thing. And of course, the risk is democracy washing, right? I mean, there's a great book called Democratic Illusions by Jenia Fuji Johnson, and she says we do all these participatory democratic exercises in Canada, and everyone seems to buy into them, including the politicians, and then they don't do anything with them. So there is a risk of democracy washing, that you run things through this process and then never do anything with them. But I would imagine, we say, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have a CA. Then we're going to put it to the legislature. And it's a big publicized thing that everyone takes part in for months. And then the legislature says, well, no, thanks. I would have to imagine that there would be a political consequence for that. And if not, well, then that says something about how much the population wants or doesn't want the thing. So that's my general sense of it.
I think too, one of the things about a recommendation from a citizens' assembly, even if it takes, a substantial amount of time to get a citizens' assembly and to get a recommendation, that recommendation is going to last. So, I mean, if you look at, say the federal ERE, nobody can hold that up and say, I'm going to run on that. Or any of these other committees that happened so many years ago or that have become part of history, right? But when a national citizens' assembly recommends something, that is going to stand the test of time until it's enacted or defeated in a referendum, which hopefully, as David mentioned, referendums aren't the best way to go. But it has a longer shelf life because of its legitimacy. It can't be dismissed as, the parties couldn't agree, there's no consensus, right? There is a consensus, they just don't, if they don't want to act on it, it's not going to go away. The other questions I got in the email were around basically the same thing. And maybe people can comment on this. How do we get the parties who don't want reform to see that reform is in their best interest and to buy into this? It's the $1 million question.
I don't think we necessarily start with convincing the parties or the politicians. We start with convincing the voters that the system's not working for them and let them put pressure on their parties of choice. And politicians only move towards this because it's more politically costly not to.
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back to the point I made earlier about being frustrated with the federal process a few years ago. Part of this whole movement is just working at it, doing the groundwork, staying at it, and then waiting for your opportunity and then jumping at it, right? It's that old line from Picasso that I'll paraphrase, that opportunity should find you at work. And so you lay the groundwork, you do it, you organize, you pressure, you press, and then when the opportunity arises, you have a plan to lock in some sort of process that gives you a shot at it. And there was a little bit of that in British Columbia recently. There was very little of that federally a few years ago. And I remember going to the committee, the ERRE committee, as a witness when it was in Vancouver. And I said to the committee, including the NDP and the Greens, we should have a citizens' assembly on this. And they said to me, well, isn't that what we're for? And I said, boy, you're going to get rolled hard. The Liberals are going to roll you on this. And that's exactly what they did. So I would say part of this is that we keep pressuring. And definitely, as Shoni says, we get through the voters. But when finally the opportunity arises once again, we commit to a process that gives us a fair shot, because if not, we're going to get rolled every single time, as we did federally, as we did kind of in BC, in PEI, for instance, and in Quebec. We got to find a way to commit to that process and to a single system, perhaps, when this is all done, as Shoni mentioned too, because if not, they're just going to keep rolling us over and over and over again.
So I think that's a great place. We're almost ready to end it. So yeah, I think we need to unite around, not just around proportional representation. We're getting to be a much stronger community for that, but around a process that brings other people in, including people that aren't sure if proportional representation is the answer. That's okay. You don't have to be a true believer to think that a citizens assembly is a good way to go. And I mean, there's clearly enough public support, people feeling there's something not working with first past the post, that this should be looked at, that the promise being broken was a problem. There's a lack of trust. I mean, and this is a way for politicians, whether they support PR or not, to reestablish trust with voters by saying, you know what happened last time? I mean, we can't keep going back and dumping on the Liberals, whether people feel it's deserved or not. That's not moving us forward. What's moving us forward is, okay, now what would be the next step for us to get buy-in that will put us in a stronger position than we were last time, which is what David is saying, where last time we weren't in a strong enough position with the process that we had. So, talk to, if people are asking, what can I do? Well, you can go visit your MP. So, if you want to do that, please get in touch with me. We've been doing MP visits for the last 4 or 5 months, taking them a little booklet about our call for a Citizens Assembly, telling them what a Citizens Assembly is, why it works. This whole thing around taking it outside the partisan political process and restoring trust are things that are resonating with MPs that we're talking to. So that's something you can go and talk to your MP about. And hopefully in this parliament, with everyone's work pressuring, lobbying MPs, we will get something to vote on in this parliament. That's our goal, is to get something to vote on in this parliament that will have the broadest possible support from MPs and give them no reason not to vote for it. So what we don't want is a motion that kind of reads like, because the Liberals are liars and blah, 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 now vote for a Citizens Assembly. That's not going to get yes votes, okay? So it has to be something that has appeal as a process across the political spectrum where everybody can see this is a step forward, but it's also not so threatening that the MPs will say, okay, if I vote yes for this, I might be out of a job in 2 years. That scares them, right? So we need that next step, and we need everybody who took the time to attend today to help us lobby to get that next step on electoral reform. Okay, is there any, I want to thank everybody. I haven't heard from Steve. I don't know if he's still on the phone.
He dropped off about 15 minutes ago, so I don't know if he had to go or he lost the phone connection.
Okay. Well, thanks, Steve, anyway, because that was really insightful to hear his comments on the reference panel on Pharmacare. And you can see that whether, it's electoral reform, Pharmacare, climate, you can see the commonalities about how this process works on a variety of really difficult, intractable issues. I wanted to thank David for taking his time to come on and talk about this. And I hope everybody will check out his book, Too Dumb for Democracy, with a question mark.
Question mark.
No, we're not, as long as we have the best institutions to help us figure it out.
That's right.
Yeah, and Shoni for sharing her personal experience and all her leadership. It's a great example of how a process like this took somebody who had one point of view, changed their mind, and turned them into, activist isn't quite the word, but a leader on these kind of issues for the last 20 years, really seeing the power of these processes up close and personal is what changes people's mind, to go back to the stories. So
I started the Citizens Assembly with my 6-month-old sitting on my desk and he's voting in his first provincial election next election. So come on, guys. Really thought that, I would have hoped that he would not be still voting under first past the post, but it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're building that wave of support to get us to the next step.
I have, however, for those people asking what you can do, I have, since my kids have been very young, going into their social studies classes and talking about voting systems so that they're aware and their classmates are aware that there are other alternatives. So,
right. So
I'm playing the long game here.
There's many ways to get involved, so if you want to get involved, go to our website, check it out. Check out our Citizens Assembly website, nationalcitizensassembly.ca, our regular website, fairvote.ca. If you want to help, we're 99% volunteers. So we need your time. We need your money. We need your passion. Whatever you have to give, it's more than welcome. Okay, so thank you very much
Thank you
for joining us. Okay, bye.